August 1944, somewhere outside Le Mans. The once proud 9th Panzer Division was now a handful of scattered men hiding in hedgerows, their uniforms caked with mud, their stomachs empty, their orders meaningless. 20-year-old Hans Keller knelt, behind a shattered stone wall, clutching his rifle and listening to the rumble of American tanks rolling closer. The sky stank of oil and cordite. Around him, a few surviving comrades whispered prayers, their faces hollow from exhaustion and fear. The radio operator had gone silent hours ago. Their lieutenant had vanished during the night. The message was simple. Hold the line. But what line? When the first Sherman appeared through the smoke, Hans didn't even lift his weapon. He watched as a boy no older than 16 fumbled with a Panzerfaust, hands shaking. "Don't," Hans muttered. "It's over." He stood, raised his arms, and stepped into the open. American soldiers shouted, rifles trained, but they didn't fire. One sergeant, sweat-streaked and sunburned, approached slowly, took Hans's weapon, then reached into his pocket and offered a pack of cigarettes. For a second, Hans couldn't move. It felt like mockery, until he realized it wasn't. By nightfall, he was in a line of prisoners being marched toward trucks. They were given water, bread, even a smile or two. Propaganda had told him the Allies would shoot them like dogs. Instead, they treated them like men. As the convoy rolled toward the coast under a red evening sky, Hans began to wonder for the first time in years, what if everything he'd believed was wrong? In October 1944, a gray English fog rolled across the docks of Southampton as a Liberty ship eased into port. Among the weary German prisoners stepping ashore was 20-year-old Karl Becker, a former Panzer grenadier who hadn't seen a civilian town since 1941. His boots hit British soil with a sense of disbelief. He had expected ruins and vengeance, the hell German propaganda had promised. Instead, he saw a functioning city. Buses running on schedule, dock workers laughing, shop windows lit even in rationing. The prisoners were herded onto trucks and driven north through the countryside. Through the fogged windows, Karl watched green, fields and stone villages blur by. Women in overalls guided tractors through harvest fields. Children waved as convoys passed. For the first time in years, he was seeing a world untouched by war, a world that looked impossibly normal. Their destination was Camp 187, near the small village of Ashwell in Hertfordshire. Rows of wooden huts surrounded by barbed wire, watchtowers, standing like tired sentries. Familiar architecture of captivity. Yet the details were different. There were electric lights in the barracks, hot water, medical tents, even a small library. At the first assembly, the commandant, Major Thompson, addressed them in careful, deliberate German. "You are prisoners of war. You are under the protection of the Geneva Convention. You will be treated as soldiers, not criminals. You will work, you will be fed, and if you behave, you will be respected." Karl didn't believe a word of it. He had seen too much betrayal dressed in polite language. But that evening, when the mess hall served stew with real meat and warm bread, disbelief began to crack. The portions were generous, far beyond what a frontline soldier ever received. Tea with milk followed, sugar, actual sugar. At his table, a grizzled veteran named Schmidt whispered, "They're fattening us for something." But the meals kept coming, day after day. And no punishment followed, no tricks, just routine, food, and quiet. By November, work details were assigned. The war had stripped Britain of young farmhands, and German POWs were needed to keep food production going. Karl was assigned to a nearby farm, Ashwell Farm, 150 acres of heavy soil and frost-hardened fields, owned by Thomas Hartley, a man who still walked with a limp from the last war. Hartley greeted the new workers with blunt efficiency. "You'll start with potatoes," he said through a British guard who translated roughly. "I don't care if you're prisoners or kings. Potatoes don't dig themselves." The first day nearly broke Karl. The ground was cold, the tools heavy, his hands soft from weeks of idleness. Yet there was something honest about the work. No shouting officers, no useless drills, just the rhythm of digging and lifting. At midday, Hartley's wife, Margaret, appeared with a tray of sandwiches and a pot of tea. "They're working, Tom," she said firmly when her husband hesitated. "Working men get fed." Carl accepted the food with suspicion, but she simply moved on, serving each man with matter-of-fact calm. The guard, Albert, translated Hartley's muttered remark. "My grandson's fighting in France. Strange world feeding the men who shot at him." Carl looked up from his sandwich. "My sister's in Dresden. I haven't heard from her in almost a year," he said quietly. "We all have someone we're missing." Hartley didn't respond. But the next day the sandwiches came again. Weeks passed. The routine settled into something that felt dangerously close to peace. Work, eat, sleep. Sundays brought no labor, only quiet and sometimes music from a distant church. The farm became a kind of second existence, fenced but open, captive but free. December brought snow, and with it, small changes. The guards began leaving their rifles behind. The men joked with locals in broken English. A few villagers even smiled back. Then came the announcement: well-behaved prisoners could accept Christmas invitations from British families. Carl never expected one. But on Christmas Eve, Albert handed him a note. "You're invited to Christmas dinner, the Hartleys." On Christmas Day, Carl walked the muddy road to the farmhouse. Inside, the smell of roast chicken filled the air. Thomas Hartley wore his best suit, Margaret a simple green dress. Their daughter Anne sat beside her husband, a local mechanic. There was also Reverend Matthews there to keep propriety in balance. Dinner began with cautious conversation. Then, as wine loosened tongues, it turned into something more human. Hartley spoke of his time in the trenches in 1916, the Christmas truce when both sides played football in no man's land. Carl told them, haltingly, about his retreat from Normandy, about sleeping in ditches, about the moment he realized Germany would lose. Reverend Matthews raised his glass. "To the boys who never wanted to fight, may they all find peace." Carl went to bed that night with something he hadn't felt in years. Warmth, not from blankets, but from belonging. When Allied forces liberated the camps in Germany, the news reached even the remote corners of Britain. One morning the prisoners were ordered into the mess hall to watch film reels. What they saw burned into their memory forever. Piles of corpses, starved survivors, the machinery of murder laid bare. Carl sat motionless as the projector clicked. His throat tightened. He remembered Jewish families from his neighborhood in Dresden, gone since 1939, their absence explained with official lies. He had never asked where they went. Now he knew. That night, the camp was silent. No one sang. No one spoke. The war they thought they understood had just shifted into something unforgivable. Then, in May, Germany surrendered. The guards didn't cheer. The prisoners didn't react. Everyone just seemed to exhale as if the world itself had stopped holding its breath. But peace didn't mean freedom. Repatriation was delayed. The British needed labor. More prisoners arrived from American and Canadian camps. By late 1946, over 400,000 Germans were still in Britain, rebuilding the farms and infrastructure their bombs had once threatened. Carl continued working for the Hartleys. The relationship changed subtly. He wasn't watched anymore. He wasn't counted like contraband. When Thomas hurt his leg again, Carl took charge of the fields. His competence surprised even himself. In September, his mother's first letter arrived through the Red Cross. The envelope was thin and fragile, the handwriting unmistakable. "I am alive," she wrote. "Maria is missing. Dresden is in ruins. Do not come back. The Russians are arresting all soldiers. Stay where you are, if they let you. Build a life." Carl read it again and again. Each time the same sentence cut deeper. Don't come back. 1946 turned to 1947, and rumors spread. Britain would allow some prisoners to stay voluntarily, to work as civilians. About 30,000 applied. One cold morning, Thomas Hartley called Carl into his office. "You're a good worker," he said. "Better than good. If you want to stay, I'll sponsor you. You'll get housing, fair wages, the Eastfield cottage. You've earned it." Carl was speechless. "You'd trust me? After everything?" Hartley chuckled. "Son, you've been working my land for 2 years. I trust you more than half my British hires before the war. You need a future. I need a farmer. Seems simple enough." That evening, Carl wrote to his mother. "They've offered me a chance to stay. I don't know if it's right, but maybe it's survival." 3 weeks later, her reply came. "You ask if I can forgive you for not coming home. I ask if you can forgive me for being relieved. Stay. Live. That is what a mother wants." In June 1947, Carl Becker ceased to be a prisoner. The paperwork changed his status to civilian agricultural worker. He moved into the small cottage on the farm, 2 rooms, a stove, and a key that locked from the inside. For the first time since he was 18, he closed a door and felt truly safe. "You'll need furniture," Hartley said, handing him a cup of tea. "Can't have my new farm manager sleeping on the floor." Carl smiled for the first time in years. "Farm manager?" Hartley winked. "What did you think you've been doing for the last 6 months?" By 1949, Carl's English was fluent. He managed crop rotations, negotiated with suppliers, and even attended town council meetings. Some villagers still looked at him with quiet distrust. The German, but others nodded in greeting. Progress came in inches, not leaps. That November, Hartley made it official. "You're now a partner, 20% ownership. You've earned your place here." Carl didn't know how to respond. He just shook the old man's hand and tried not to cry. That same winter, at a local church gathering, he met Sarah Williams, a schoolteacher. She was practical, kind, and unafraid to challenge anyone. Her father had died in North Africa fighting the Germans, yet she looked Carl in the eye without hate. "I used to think all Germans were monsters," she told him one evening. "Then I realized monsters don't plant fields or fix tractors. People do." They married in 1950. Schmidt, the old veteran, served as best man. Hartley walked Sarah down the aisle. It wasn't the kind of wedding either side had imagined years earlier, but maybe that was the point. The 1950s brought children, Elizabeth in 1951, Thomas in 1953, and quiet prosperity. Ashwell Farm expanded under Carl's management. Post-war Britain was rebuilding, and food production mattered more than politics. The villagers who had once avoided him now bought eggs from his wife and praised his wheat yields. When Thomas Hartley died in 1955, Carl delivered the eulogy. His voice shook as he said, "He saw a man where others saw an enemy." Margaret Hartley passed a decade later, leaving her share of the farm to Carl in her will. Her letter was short. "You earned this. Thank you for proving my husband right." By the late 1960s, Carl was a respected British farmer with deep roots in a country he once viewed through barbed wire. But his thoughts often wandered east, to Dresden, to his mother. When the final letter came in 1967, it was postmarked months before her death. "I never saw you again, but I read every letter. You built something good. You chose life over ruin. I am proud of you." Carl stood in the fields that day, reading those words again and again as the wind carried the scent of freshly turned soil. His wife Sarah found him there, silent, tears on his face. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. The years kept moving. Britain changed. The world moved on. By 1973, the government allowed long-term German residents to apply for citizenship. Carl filled out the forms, attached his war record, and 6 months later, swore an oath of allegiance to the country that had once imprisoned him. Schmidt stood beside him at the ceremony. "We've had stranger journeys," he said with a grin. "I came expecting to die in a camp. Now I'm British with a pension." Carl raised his glass. "To surviving long enough to live again." By 1980, he'd been running Ashwell Farm for over 3 decades. His son now worked beside him, carrying on what had started as forced labor. Journalists began writing about men like Karl, German POWs who stayed. He always downplayed it. "I didn't do anything special," he'd say. "I just worked. They treated me decently. I stayed because it was a place where I could build something, not destroy it." Yet one interviewer pressed him. "Do you ever feel guilty for staying?" Karl thought for a long moment. "Every day. My mother died alone because I didn't go back. But if I had, I'd be dead too, or worse. Some choices aren't between right and wrong, just between life and loss. You carry both." In 1990, Karl was 70 years old when he watched the Berlin Wall fall on television. Crowds dancing, families reunited. He stared at the screen for a long time. "My mother would have loved to see this," he said quietly. "She waited behind that wall her whole life." Sarah touched his hand. "She knew you were safe. That was enough." Karl nodded slowly. "I hope so." Karl Becker died in 2003, age 79, surrounded by family in the farmhouse he had once worked as a prisoner. At his funeral, his son stood before the villagers and said, "My father taught me that you can't choose where you're born or what war you're thrown into, but you can choose what you build after." He came here as a prisoner and stayed as a neighbor, a husband, a father, and a farmer. He proved that even in the wreckage of war, you can plant something new and watch it grow. The crowd was silent for a long moment. Outside, the fields Karl had once dug under guard swayed gently in the wind. The final, wordless proof of the life he had built from surrender. Not just a farm that thrived, but a living reminder that war doesn't always end with surrender. Sometimes it ends with understanding. That an enemy can become a neighbor, that a prisoner can become a friend. Karl Becker's grave rests quietly beneath an oak tree at the edge of Ashwell. The headstone is simple. Karl Becker, 1924-2003. Farmer, husband, father, friend, no mention of battles or medals, only the life he built after the guns fell silent. He wasn't alone in that choice. Across Britain, more than 25,000 former German POWs made the same decision. To stay, to rebuild, to trade their uniforms for overalls and their rifles for plows. Each man planting his roots in the same soil he once feared, proving that peace isn't signed. It's lived day after day. Karl's story isn't about surrender. It's about transformation. How humanity, given a chance, grows even in the ruins of war. From the ditches of France to the fields of Hertfordshire, his life became a quiet revolution. A reminder that sometimes the most powerful victories happen long after the war is over. And maybe that's the lesson hidden in history's forgotten corners. That compassion can outlast conflict, and the soil of an old battlefield can still grow something beautiful. If stories like this remind you that history is more than battles, it's about people, make sure to subscribe. Because there are thousands more untold moments of grace, courage, and humanity waiting to be rediscovered.